Hey friends, welcome to or welcome back to another episode of Cold-Blooded Serial. I am your host and true crime bestie, Tika. Friends, I've been obsessed with vampires since I was a little girl. I'd watch vampire movies with my mom, and then I'd run to the mirror in hopes that my eye teeth, or my vampire teeth, would grow overnight, although I haven't been bit. One time, I even swore I had 2 little bite marks on my neck, probably from mosquitoes, I don't know. But I was like, oh my gosh, this is it. I'm gonna be a vampire. Anyways, my husband thinks I'm crazy for even sharing this story with you guys, but that's how obsessed I was with vampires, okay? But vampires are myths, right? Just creatures born from folklore. Well, what happens when the monster is not a myth? What happens when the vampire walks among us in broad daylight, hiding behind an unassuming face? Join me as I share with you the chilling story of a man whose darkest impulses led to unspeakable horrors. Today, I'm going to share with you the story of Richard Chase, the man who turned his delusions into our darkest nightmares. Let's dive in. In the late 1970s, the city of Sacramento became the hunting ground for a killer so disturbed, so unhinged, that he would forever be known as the Sacramento Vampire. Friends, this isn't the story of a calculated criminal mastermind. It's the story of a man whose madness spiraled out of control, leaving behind a trail of horror, blood, and unthinkable tragedy. Let's start with Richard's backstory. What happened in his childhood that made him into the monster that he became? Was he born evil, or did circumstances make him evil? Let's find out. Richard Trenton Chase was born on May 23, 1950, in Santa Clara, California. When he was 3, his family moved to Sacramento, and the following year, his little sister Pamela was born. In elementary school, all of his teachers liked him. They said he was the sweetest. He had plenty of friends, and on the outside, everything seemed normal. But at home, things were not normal. When he was just 2 years old, his dad force-fed him until he threw up. As Richard grew older, the violence at home got worse. His sister Pam remembers that disagreements between father and son always ended with their father shaking Richard or throwing him against the wall. Their father was also emotionally abusive, especially to Richard more than anyone else. So Richard Sr. was an alcoholic who mismanaged their money and cheated on his wife. So due to their marital problems, his parents fought a lot. When he was just 10 years old, he became extremely interested in dead animals, fascinated with their blood and insides. Yeah, it sounds a little twisted, but he hasn't killed an animal, so does this qualify him for a serial killer? I mean, obviously, because I'm sharing this, obviously something happens, right? Normally, as a child or a teenager, serial killers begin to kill animals. They're just not obsessed with what's already dead. So I don't know. Let's keep diving in. Let's see, okay? So, friends, I spoke too soon because shortly after that, he begins killing cats and birds and rabbits and dogs. Yeah, these are all the signs of a serial killer. So I definitely just ate my words. It became so often that his neighbors began noticing that there were no more stray cats in the neighborhood. And then his mom found a cat buried in her flower garden. Right there, his mom should have been like, hey, son, what's going on? Because this is not normal kid behavior. She should have pulled them aside and been like, honey, let's try to get to the bottom of this problem that you're having. She should have been like, hey, son, talk to me. What's going on? You know what? Let's take a quick drive to the local church and, get you baptized real quickly. Just a couple dunks in some holy water, because why are you killing small animals? But his mom really doesn't realize any of the red flags that he showed prior to killing. Honestly, I think she saw them, but she was just in such denial that she didn't want to admit that something was wrong with her son. I really believe that's what it is. Let's get back to his backstory. At 13 years old, poor Richard really begins to lose touch with reality. For years, he has witnessed his parents fighting, and then he was also being abused from his dad. So I really think that his brain began to put up a barrier to protect him, because now at 13 years old, he is 100% convinced that he is in the Jesse James game. My mom was a huge Western fan, so that's how I know who Jesse James is. But apparently back during the Western times, which I don't even know what years or century that was, but back then, Jesse James was a really infamous bank robber. It's the 70s, and Jesse James has been long gone, but yet Richard is 100% convinced that he works for Jesse James. He also liked to set the house to 90 degrees when he was home alone, and he would just lay naked on the sofa in the living room. My dad would have flipped out, like, what are you doing? Why does it feel like a sauna inside of our house? And then, if that wasn't crazy enough, he began playing with fire, and he would often get caught setting small fires within the house. Dude, why hasn't his parents sat down with him yet to be like, son, what's going on with you? Because none of these are normal. So someone should have seen this and been like, you know what? Something's going on with Richard. We really need to get him help, or sit down and give our son some loving attention, not violent, angry attention. My heart definitely goes out to young Richard before he becomes a complete maniac. All right, so in the middle of his freshman year of high school, his mom pulls up to the school and she's like, hey, Richard, pack your stuff. We're moving to LA today. It's just going to be me, you, and your sister, and we're moving in with grandma. 8 days later, Richard Sr. drives to Los Angeles to bring his son back to Sacramento with him. With the relationship that Richard Sr. and Richard Jr. had, his mom should have been like, no, you're not taking my son anywhere because you're not a good dad. Simple as that. If the little sister witnessed him throwing Richard into a wall, I know that the mom saw it too. So Richard moves back in with his dad, and then 4 months later, his mom Beatrice and his little sister Pamela moves back to Sacramento into their family home. At school, Richard did seem to fit in. He had plenty of friends and a couple girlfriends. And honestly, guys, he wasn't a bad-looking kid at all. If you go to my YouTube page, you will see that he looks like he would have fit that role of Mr. Popular. So, he was becoming popular. He had a lot of friends, a few girlfriends, but none of his relationships lasted because he was impotent. He was into girls, but his manhood just wouldn't work. And at 15 years old, that has got to be humiliating, because honestly, I didn't even think that someone so young could have erectile dysfunction, but I found out that it's usually a genetic trait. So it's usually passed down from the dad to the son, which probably explains why his dad is such a jerk, because he's dealing with all this built-up testosterone. I don't know. But if this is happening to Richard Jr. at such a young age, I would assume that it happened to his dad at this young age too. And the dad honestly should have been like, hey son, man to man, let's have this talk. because you're probably interested in hooking up with girls. So let's have this talk just in case you're having the same problem that I had. But they didn't. And Richard felt weak and broken. So he thought his penis was broken because he didn't have enough blood. And to remedy this, only one thing can be done in this situation. To see a doctor, right? No, silly. Not to see a doctor. That's what normal people would do. He began drinking the blood of animals. Yes, friends, you heard me. The blood of animals. So now it's 1969, and at 18 years old, he decides to visit a psychiatrist for his erectile dysfunction and for his emotional instability. He said his parents were still fighting and it was stressing him out. And Richard, I am so proud of you for doing this on your own, for realizing that something's wrong with you and for going to see a doctor about it. The psychiatrist told him that the erectile dysfunction came from emotional abuse, like anxiety or repressed rage towards women. The psychiatrist also felt that his patient was mentally ill, but didn't need intervention. So, because this doctor didn't do his job, Richard was let out into society to later become a serial killer. And friends, this is not the first doctor that's going to fail Richard. There's going to be quite a few in his life that I don't know what it was, but they were like, yeah, you seem crazy, but I think you got this, okay? Like, I think you're going to be able to just go into society and figure this shit out on your own. Yeah, doctors not doing their job, and that sucks. Like, they really failed this young man, because had one of the doctors done what they were supposed to do, we probably wouldn't even know about Richard Chase today. So, Richard heard what his doctor said about the erectile dysfunction, but he's like, no, doctor, you're wrong. It's not because I have emotional issues or I'm anxious or have repressed rage. It's because blood is my issue. My body is low on blood. I need you to see this, doctor. I need you to see what I'm saying, and I need you to help me fix it, okay? So, of course, the doctor's like, dude, like, no. I told you what the problem is. That's it. Go be free. So, as time went on, Richard suffered silently and alone. He became unkempt, and he stopped taking showers, and he began neglecting his hygiene. He lived in filth, and his friends no longer visited. He went into a shell and just completely withdrew himself from others. To be honest, it sounds like he has an extreme case of depression or some other mental illness, and he needs support from his family and a good psychiatrist. Surprisingly, though, his dad was the first in the family to be like, hey, something's wrong with our son. We need to figure this out and we need to get him some help. But his mom's like, no, it's the 60s. Kids nowadays are all looking grimy and unkept, hippie-like. He's fine. No, Beatrice, your son's not fine. He actually needs help. And this is the first time, probably in his life, that his dad is trying to do what's best for Richard. But his dad didn't take him to get the help that he actually needed. He just was like, well, you know what? Beatrice has been the one raising our son for all these years. She knows what's best. I'm just going to let it go. Then later that year, Richard began working and going to college. His parents were like, maybe that nastiness of his was just a phase, and our boy is going to be all right. They were hopeful, but their hopefulness didn't last long. Before the school year was over, Richard got expelled and lost his motivation to continue his education. His depression grew, but as he sat and moped on the stairs of an apartment, two young ladies walked by. One was a former friend from high school, and before you know it, the three of them are conversing, And his old friend was like, hey, Richard, like, I see you're going through a really rough time. Do you want to come live with us? And he's like, oh my God, yes, I would love to. And he's like, I finally found a new home away from my parents. But friends, just with the little bit of information that I've given you, you can probably only imagine that this honeymoon phase doesn't last long. The two young ladies quickly realize that they have an unstable psychopath living with them. So, his drug habit became a problem because although he liked to smoke weed, he also liked using LSD. But the combination of the two made him paranoid, and he always thought someone was after him. So he ended up boarding his bedroom door closed and boarding up the closet door. He stopped paying rent because he couldn't keep a job, and his hygiene became a problem again. The women said that his smell was so repulsive that, like, you could smell him as soon as he walked in a room. And then they also tried not to upset him because they realized that he also had a gun. They wanted him to leave for good, but they were so scared that they began packing their bags so they could leave instead. One of the young ladies actually told her brother about the situation. So her brother moves in, and once Richard starts acting crazy around him, the brother roughs him up and is like, hey, you got to get out of here. Richard now has no choice but to move back home with his parents. Once he's back at home, his paranoia increased. He swore up and down that his mom was trying to poison him and control his mind. He then decorated his room walls, but not with posters, friends, with pictures of human hearts that he cut out of an anatomy book. Now it's 1971, and Richard is 20 years old. Richard's parents ended up divorcing, and he was living in his childhood home alone. This loneliness made him even crazier. He began thinking that his body was deteriorating and that his stomach was on backwards. What do you mean, your stomach is on backwards? I've never, ever... I watch movies that are completely out there sometimes, okay? And then, I do my research on serial killers or killers, crimes, and I have never heard anyone say something like this before. I really want to know what he meant by your stomach is on backwards. But that's what he believed. And he also believed that his heart would stop. So, blood, once again, would solve all of his problems. And things with him got so bad that there were times when he would lose his ability to speak or write his name. Honestly, right there, if nothing else told you that something was wrong with your son, when he lost his ability to speak or write, he should have been rushed to the hospital immediately. But his family just never did. I think his parents just focused on Pamela and was like, you know what, she's our normal kid. We're going to focus on her and just try to keep her happy and healthy and safe. They really didn't give Richard what he needed. So he ended up moving in with his mom. And when he would speak, it would always be to argue with her. But all of their arguments turned into physical altercations. When his mom, Beatrice, couldn't take it anymore, she was like, hey, you need to go live with your dad. Things weren't any better there. At first, he was too scared to physically fight his dad, but they did argue a lot. When his dad got tired of it, he's like, hey, you need to go move back in with your mom and your sister. And of course, it wasn't long before she witnessed him mistreating their mom. And still, no one was like, you know what, we need to go get him some psychological help. One time he beat his mom in the head with a phone after she tried to call 911 because of his violent behavior. I know parents want to support their kids, but listen, after the first time he was physical with me, there's no way I would let him back in my house. No, you need to find somewhere else because just the blatant disrespect of you putting your hands on me as your mother. Like, no. Okay, so after he beat her with the phone, she was like, yeah, you gotta go. In 1973, she sends him to live with her mother back in LA, which is shocking because it's like, if you can't control your son, what makes you think that your elderly mother is going to be able to control him? But I don't know. Maybe he's like, you know what? It's grandma. I'm going to be good for her. But grandma was shocked by how thin he had gotten. She said it looked like he hadn't eaten in months. His hair was long and matted, and he reeked. It was obvious that he stopped taking showers again. For the 2 months that he lived with her, he would sleep during the day and would be awake at night. Friends, what does that sound like? That sounds just like a vampire. It's insane. He told her he had a vitamin deficiency, and he would wrap his head with a towel that was filled with orange slices. And then he would talk to himself, saying things like, Richard, you're a good boy, aren't you? And then he would answer himself, yes, you're a good boy. Dude, like, what? No, As your grandmother and someone who loves you, we're gonna go get you checked out, because what the heck is going through your head? Like, this is insane. So later on, she ends up finding a .22 caliber handgun, and that was her final straw. She's like, no, grandson, I love you, but you gotta go. You gotta go back to your parents in Sacramento. Now, at 23 years old, Richard Jr. moves back into his dad's home. Richard Sr. was like, son, you're a man now. You need to stop this strange behavior and get a job. The two of them begins to argue over this. And before they know it, they are in the middle of a fist fight. Of course, Richard Sr.'s like, that's it. You're going back to live with your mom. Once he moved back in with his mom at 23 years old, he begged his mom to bring him to a doctor because he's like, Mom, I'm sick. I don't know what's wrong with me, but there's something wrong and I need to see a doctor. She's like, no, you're fine. There's nothing wrong with you. You look good. You're not going to a doctor. I mean, those weren't her exact words, but she didn't bring him to a doctor. So she obviously thought he was okay, which makes me think that something's wrong with her, okay? Because all of the signs that something's wrong with your child has been there for years. This is not something that just happened yesterday. Like, it's been there. He's been showing you signs that his mental stability is slowly or quickly declining. And yet, because of your pride, your ego, you're like, no, I can't have people thinking that something's wrong with my kid. Who the hell cares what people think? Bring your kid to get the help that they need. Now that he's a fucking serial killer, what are people thinking about you now? Huh, Beatrice? Now the world knows who your kid is and what your kid has done. And you, Beatrice, could have helped to stop it. Sorry, you guys. I just went off on a little rant, but let's bring it back, okay? Richard realized that he needed help, and he started calling the fire department often, telling them that he was going into cardiac arrest. Of course, every time they arrived, he was fine. However, there was one paramedic who begged Beatrice to bring her son to a hospital because this paramedic knew that something was wrong with him. Maybe not physically, but a 23-year-old who's claiming to have cardiac arrest multiple times, there's something wrong. This kid is crying out for help. So, finally, this paramedic is the one who snapped Beatrice out of her denial. And when they bring him to the hospital, they find out that he has been suffering from chronic acute paranoid schizophrenia. The doctor tells Beatrice that he wants to hold Richard there for 72 hours, but Richard and his mom was like, no, doc, we got it from here. We just needed to know what was wrong. Now we can fix this problem. I'm sorry, are you guys psychiatrists? No, you're not. If you were able to fix this problem, you wouldn't be at the doctor's right now. 3 years later, in 1976, Richard sees a new doctor. And this doctor is like, okay, to help control your anxiety, I'm going to give you this oxygen tank. When you start feeling these abnormalities happening, I want you to breathe into this tank. Well, this worked. And Richard began taking care of himself, taking care of his hygiene, exercising, and eating. And he ended up gaining 20 pounds. But just like before, this positivity in his life didn't last long. And within a few months, the unstable Richard was back. He's like, my mom began poisoning me again, so I can't eat. He began talking to someone in the room with him, but there was no one else there. And he began being violent towards his mom and his sister. Beatrice truly became fearful when he began his childhood hobby of torturing animals again. He almost killed the family dog, and now this poor dog struggles to eat. So friends, when I read the book, The Vampire of Sacramento, The True Story of Richard Chase by Genevieve Ortiz, I thought that the dog was like a small dog. The family dog, you guys, was a German Shepherd. Like, what the heck did you do to this German Shepherd where you would almost kill him and now he struggles to eat? That poor dog. But honestly, that's what his mom should have been like. Even if he doesn't belong in jail, he needs to be locked up in a psych center and maybe never ever come out, because what did you do? And like I said, this is always the first stage, killing animals. So shortly after that, his parents decided that he needs... Oh my God. Okay, so shortly after him almost killing the family dog, his parents aren't like, hey, let's go get him some psychological help. They say, you know what? He needs to live alone, unsupervised, where he's free to fulfill whatever dark fantasies are going through his head. Yeah. You know what, Mom and Dad? That is a brilliant but a very stupid idea, because he's not a normal person. He does not need to be alone to fulfill his fucking sick fantasies. He needs to be in the care of someone who can actually help him. So, Richard is blaming all of his problems on the lack of blood in his body. And his craving for blood was not being satisfied. And he felt that there was only one thing to do. He needed to get blood by any means necessary. And friends, he really meant by any means necessary. His apartment was full of rabbits, both alive and dead. One night, he took a rabbit out of a cage, placed this poor, helpless animal on a table, cut it, and just like vampires in movies who are against killing humans, he placed his mouth on the rabbit's wound and drank. And then he bit on the rabbit's flesh and began to eat its organs. With the organs and blood that he didn't eat, he blended it up to make himself a warm, bloody smoothie. Oh my God, that's so gross. Friends, that is absolutely sickening. One night after Richard did this routine, his dad came to visit and noticed the numerous cages with bunnies in it. Suspicious, he's like, son, why do you have so many rabbits? And Richard's like, I eat them. His dad just shrugs it off like it's a normal response. Dude, right there. Like, there were so many missed opportunities of his parents being like, you know what? We need to send him to a psych center, because eating live rabbits is not normal. But his dad was just like, oh, okay, yeah, that's what I expected. And friends, this is where I leave you. Stay tuned as we continue in the Sacramento Vampire series. This is the first episode of 3. Stay safe and I will talk to you soon. Bye.